What you're about to hear is not just a story about two world leaders disagreeing over a phone call. This is a story about power, perception, and the battle to control the narrative of one of the most consequential relationships in the modern world. And it begins with a single speech delivered in the Swiss Alps that sent shockwaves from Washington to Brussels and ended with 4 words spoken at a cabinet door in Ottawa that stopped the Trump administration cold. Stay with Floyd at Foxy Global News, because every detail of what unfolded over the next week matters deeply. To understand the full weight of what happened, you need to go back to the afternoon of January 20th, 2026, in Davos, Switzerland. The World Economic Forum had gathered the most powerful figures in global business and politics under one roof, as it does every January. Heads of state, central bank governors, Fortune 500 CEOs, senior military officials, nearly 3,000 people representing over 130 countries packed into that hall. And on that Tuesday afternoon, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked onto the stage and delivered a speech that no Western leader had dared to give in years. He did not mention Donald Trump by name. He did not need to. Every person in that room knew exactly who he was talking about and exactly what he meant. Carney told the assembled audience that the rules-based international order, the entire framework of institutions, laws, and mutual obligations that had governed global relations since the end of World War II, was not weakening. It was not declining. It was not under strain. It was over. His exact word was rupture, not transition, not evolution, not reform. Rupture, a tearing apart. He told the room that middle powers like Canada had for decades been living inside what he called a useful fiction. The comforting story that everyone followed the same rules, that the most powerful nations operated with restraint, and that deeper integration with larger economies brought genuine mutual benefit to all parties. That fiction, he said, no longer holds. The world has changed fundamentally, and any leader who pretends otherwise is deceiving their own people. Then came the line that traveled around the world and did not stop traveling. Carney looked directly at his audience and said, "You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination." The audience rose to their feet. A standing ovation in Davos is genuinely rare. These are not people who applaud easily. Bob Rae, Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations, said afterward that he had never seen a global reaction to a speech like this one. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said the speech confirmed that Canada was back as a pivotal NATO participant and a serious global leader. California Governor Gavin Newsom said that numerous American leaders were privately sending him the transcript, saying simply one word: wow. The speech drew praise across the political spectrum in ways that were genuinely unusual and deeply significant. It was delivered on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Donald Trump was standing on the same Davos stage for a virtual address, and his response was pointed and personal. He looked into the camera and said directly, "Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements." The collision between these two men, between these two visions of what the Canada-US relationship actually is, had been set in motion. And what happened next is what Floyd and the team at Foxy Global News have been breaking down piece by piece because the details matter enormously. Trump's Davos response was brief, but the follow-up from his administration was more sustained and far more revealing about how Washington intended to manage the public story of this relationship going forward. On Monday, January 26, 2026, Trump placed a phone call to Carney. The call lasted approximately 30 minutes and covered, according to Carney's own detailed account given publicly the following day, an extraordinary range of subjects: the situation in Ukraine, the situation in Venezuela, Arctic security, the China trade arrangement, Canada's broader strategy of diversifying its trade relationships through 12 new deals across 4 continents, and the upcoming review of the USMCA trade agreement. That is a genuinely substantial agenda for a single half-hour conversation between two heads of government. Multiple major issues of global significance, all covered in 30 minutes. But what the Trump administration chose to publicize about that call afterward was something else entirely. That same Monday evening, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent sat down with Sean Hannity on Fox News and offered what amounted to the Trump administration's official account of what had taken place. Bessent told the audience that he had been personally present in the Oval Office during the phone call and had witnessed it directly. And then he made a claim that was specific, deliberate, and designed to land with maximum impact. He said that Carney was, and these were his exact words, very aggressively walking back some of the unfortunate remarks he made at Davos. The phrase, unfortunate remarks, was precise and chosen carefully. The message Washington was sending to the world was unmistakable. Canada's Prime Minister, having delivered a bold and celebrated speech challenging American dominance on the world stage, had telephoned the White House and, in the privacy of the Oval Office, quietly retreated from every word of it. Bessent went even further. He said Canada depends entirely on the United States and that there is far more North-South trade between the two countries than there could ever be East-West trade within Canada itself. He criticized Carney for pushing what he called a globalist agenda. He said Carney should stop pretending and focus on what is truly best for the Canadian people. The narrative Washington wanted established in the public mind was completely clear. Carney had overreached, had been reminded of the real power dynamic at play, and had backed down privately, even while publicly claiming otherwise. It was a calculated move, designed to lock in a damaging story before the Canadian side could respond. But there was a serious problem with Bessent's account. According to Mark Carney, it was false, not slightly inaccurate, not missing context. False. The next morning, Tuesday, January 27th, Mark Carney was walking into a cabinet meeting in Ottawa when reporters stopped him in the corridor. They asked him directly about Bessent's characterization of the phone call. What happened next was watched and discussed in capitals across the world. Carney shook his head slowly. Then he rolled his eyes, publicly, visibly, unmistakably, on camera for the entire world to see. The eye roll of a man who had been told something about himself that he considered not just wrong, but almost insulting in its dishonesty. Then he spoke. His voice was calm. His tone was measured. But what he said was unmistakably firm, direct, and completely unambiguous. He looked at the reporters and said, "To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos." He did not stop there. He walked the reporters through the actual substance of the call in real detail. He explained that he had told Trump Canada was the first country to recognize and respond to the change in American trade policy the president had initiated. He described walking Trump through the specifics of Canada's China trade arrangement. He said he had explained Canada's entire strategy of 12 new trade and security partnerships on 4 continents to be completed in 6 months. He described to Trump what Canada's diversification effort actually looked like in practice. He spoke about Ukraine, Venezuela, Arctic security, and the USMCA review. He said the conversation was good. And then he told reporters how Trump had responded to Canada's strategy. In one word, impressed, not dismissive, not skeptical, impressed. That was the word Carney used to describe the president's reaction to hearing about Canada's plans. And then came the moment that Floyd at Foxy Global News considers the most significant part of this entire story. A reporter asked Carney directly whether the world had changed in a way that made normal trade negotiations with the United States more difficult than they had ever been. Carney paused. He took a breath. And then he said exactly what he wanted to say. Calmly, deliberately, on the record, with the cameras running and the world watching. The world has changed. Washington has changed. Almost nothing is normal in the United States. Read those words again carefully, because they are extraordinary. This was not a politician venting frustration on social media. This was a sitting prime minister standing at a cabinet meeting door in Ottawa, saying calmly and with full composure that almost nothing is normal in the United States. Those words traveled to European capitals within hours. They were quoted in newspapers in Berlin, Paris, London, and Tokyo. They became a central part of the international conversation about what kind of partner the United States is becoming under this administration, and whether Western allies can rely on Washington the way they once did. What followed the competing accounts of the phone call was itself enormously revealing. Besant had stated clearly that he was physically present in the Oval Office and had personally witnessed Carney walking back his Davos remarks. Carney flatly denied that characterization in every particular. There was no official readout issued by either the White House or the Canadian Prime Minister's office following the January 26 call, a fact that conservative foreign affairs critic Michael Chong pointed out publicly, calling on the government to document clearly in writing what had actually been discussed so that all parties understood what commitments had or had not been made. That absence of any official documentation left two completely contradictory accounts competing openly in public, with no official record of any kind to resolve the dispute. Multiple major news organizations covering this story independently reached the same analytical conclusion. The two accounts could not both be true, and the absence of any White House readout was itself informative. When a call goes the way an administration claims it went, that administration is ordinarily very eager to document it. The New Republic noted pointedly that Besant appeared to be attempting to salvage Trump's dignity after Carney had genuinely upstaged him on the world stage in Davos. The credibility contest between the two accounts was not close. One account was offered on American television hours after a private call, claiming the other leader had privately capitulated. The other account was given publicly the following morning, on camera, with specific factual detail about what was said, how the conversation proceeded, and how the other party responded, including the detail that the president was impressed. What the January phone call and everything surrounding it truly reveal, when you step back and look at the whole picture, is not simply a dispute between two governments over who said what in a private conversation. It is a window into two fundamentally different strategies for managing this bilateral relationship in public, at a moment when that relationship is under historic strain. The Trump administration's approach to Canada throughout this entire period has been remarkably consistent. Assert dominance, imply dependence, use public language that frames any expression of Canadian independence as ingratitude, naivety, or a failure to understand the natural hierarchy between the two countries. The governor language, the "Canada lives because of us" line, the Besant walkback claim, the criticism of Carney's so-called globalist agenda, all of it fits the same template perfectly. The goal is to establish in the minds of both the American and Canadian public that whatever Carney says on stages in Switzerland or anywhere else, he will ultimately defer to Washington when the doors are closed and the cameras are off. Carney's approach has been equally consistent, but it is radically and deliberately different. He does not match Trump's provocations with counter-provocations of his own. He does not post aggressive statements on social media. He does not give fiery speeches attacking Washington. He keeps the register of his public language calm, factual, and controlled at all times. But, and this is the crucial part, he does not concede the framing. He pushed back on Besant's account specifically, clearly, and on the record. He told the country and the world exactly what he had actually said in that call. He used the phrase, "Almost nothing is normal in the United States," not in anger, not in emotion, but with the steady composure of a person who had thought carefully about exactly what words he wanted to use and was completely prepared to stand behind every single one of them in public. This approach was not accidental, and it was not improvised. It reflected a political calculation that Carney's domestic strength, with net favorability numbers that put him significantly ahead of Trump's standing in Canada, gave him room to be direct about Washington in a way that his predecessor Justin Trudeau had found politically difficult to sustain. It also reflected a foreign policy calculation that in a relationship where Washington was actively and publicly attempting to establish a hierarchy of dominance, a failure to push back openly would be read internationally and domestically as confirmation of that hierarchy. Silence, in this context, would have meant surrender. There is one more dimension of this story that Floyd at Foxy Global News wants you to understand, because it connects the January phone call dispute to something much larger and more urgent. On March 8, 2026, a second confirmed call between Carney and Trump took place. Both governments acknowledged it publicly, issuing a minimal joint readout that said the two leaders discussed the economy, trade relations between the two countries, and developments in the Middle East. That Middle East reference was deeply significant. By March 8, the United States and Israel had been conducting military strikes against Iran for approximately 1 week. The conflict had been building since late February, and by the time of the call, Iran had effectively restricted access through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply flows. Global energy prices were surging. Markets were reacting. Canada's Incident Response Group had convened the same day as the call, with ministers and senior officials reviewing changes to the threat landscape, focusing on protecting Canadians in the region and working with international partners to find a path toward de-escalation. Carney had explicitly stated publicly that Canada would not participate in offensive operations and that the conflict represented a failure of the international order, precisely the kind of language that connected directly back to what he had said at Davos in January. Meanwhile, the USMCA trade talks between Canada and the United States, which U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer and Canada's Dominic LeBlanc had described as constructive and substantive just 2 days earlier on March 6, were now proceeding in the shadow of a geopolitical crisis that neither country had anticipated or planned for. The March 8 call was therefore happening at a moment of compounded, stacked pressure. An active military conflict in the Middle East threatening global energy markets, ongoing and unresolved trade tensions, the looming USMCA review, and the still unresolved public battle over who told the truth about what happened during the January 26th phone call. The January phone call and everything that surrounded it is ultimately a case study in how a major diplomatic relationship functions, or struggles to function, when one party is actively trying to assert dominance and the other has decided it will not accept that framing. What Besant did on Fox News that Monday evening was a specific, deliberate act, a claim made on national television that a foreign head of government had privately capitulated on his most prominent and celebrated public position. It was designed to shape international perception before the Canadian side could respond. What Carney did the following morning was an equally specific, equally deliberate counteract, a calm, public, on-camera, on-the-record denial with substantive detail, delivered without anger, without drama, and without the slightest hint of backing down. The world has changed. Washington has changed. Almost nothing is normal in the United States. Those 11 words, delivered composedly at a cabinet meeting door in Ottawa on a Tuesday morning, traveled further and lasted longer in the global conversation than anything said on Fox News that Monday night. They were quoted by foreign ministers. They were referenced by editorial boards. They became shorthand in diplomatic circles for the new reality that America's allies are navigating every single day. And they answered, definitively and publicly, the question of whether Canada's Prime Minister would walk back what he said at Davos. He would not. The USMCA review scheduled for July 2026 will be the real test of what that refusal is ultimately worth in concrete, practical terms. But January established something that cannot be undone. There are two competing accounts of what was said in the Oval Office. One describes retreat and capitulation. The other describes candid engagement, clear communication of Canada's position, and a president who was, by the account of the man who was actually on the phone, impressed. Floyd here for Foxy Global News. If this breakdown helped you cut through the noise and understand the real dynamics beneath these headlines, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. The conversations happening between these two leaders, in private and in public, will shape the most consequential negotiations in North American history for years to come. And we will be here, following every single development, every step of the way.